When you install the extra pdoTools, it adds its own parser to extend the MODX parser. Looking at a diagram of the parsing process in MODX. More details in my last video. The pdoTools parser puts itself here. It implements the same two functions, process element tags and process tag, as the mod parser. Now when a resource is parsed, here and here, process element tags from the pdoTools is called. With the default settings, process element tags just passes the request to the mod parser. In the process tag function, however, some functionality got added. The code tries to parse simple tags itself. As we have seen, MODX creates an object for every tag it encounters, and this can be slow if a lot of tags are processed. So if it's a tag without properties and it's not a snippet or chunk tag, then the pdoParser processes the tag directly to speed up the process. Also, support for fast field tags is added here. These are tags with a hash as the token. They can be used to display fields from other resources or to access superglobals like $_get or $_post. If it's a more complex tag that the pdoParser doesn't handle, the original function of the mod parser with the same name is called. This change in the parsing process usually doesn't create problems, and most of the time you won't notice it at all. But there are edge cases where it can break the parsing. Let's say we have a TV, and we use a MODX tag in the TV value to output the page title. This works when we output the TV in the resource, but breaks when we add an uppercase output modifier. The problem is that the output modifier is applied before the page title tag is parsed, and then with all uppercase letters, the field won't be found anymore. If you encounter such problems and want to deactivate the pdoParser, you have to create a new system setting. The pdoParser gets added in the file bootstrap.php. The code reads the value of the setting modParser.class to create the parser service. The pdoParser is the default. When we add a new system setting modParser.class with the value modx_revolution_modparser, the default MODX parser will be used again. In our case, this fixes the issue with the TV output. pdoTools comes with a template engine called Fenom. With the default settings, Fenom is only used by the various pdoTools snippets like pdoResources or pdomenu. So when you use pdoResources, for example, you can use the Fenom syntax in the template chunk. Here we have a simple pdoResources call that uses the chunk myTPL. We can change the placeholder tags in the chunk to Fenom syntax. And when we view the page, the output still works. Let's explain what happens in the background. A snippet like getResources in MODX usually works like this. First you query a collection of resources from the database. Then you loop through all the resources in the result. Create an associative array of all the resource fields and their values, and use the MODX function, getChunk, to parse the chunk. But pdoTools, instead of using the MODX function getChunk, calls its own getChunk function. Here in a first step, Fenom is used to process the chunk content. If the result still contains MODX tags, then MODX placeholder tags are processed using simple string replacement. Only if the result now still contains MODX tags is the process function of the modChunk class called to run the normal MODX parsing process. If for some reason you don't want to use Fenom for chunks, go to the System Settings, namespace pdoTools, and change the setting with the key pdoTools_Fenom_default. If on the other hand, you want to use the Fenom template engine also for resources, change the setting pdoTools _Fenom _parser to yes. So let's do that. Now with this change, in the function process element tags of the PDO parser, Fenom will run to process the resource content. This happens only on the function call, when uncacheable MODX tags are parsed. Fenom runs only once. There are no iterations. So if you use mixed MODX and Fenom syntax, this is the actual execution order for tags in the template. First, cacheable MODX tags are parsed, then Fenom tags, and finally uncacheable MODX tags. Let's take a closer look at the Fenom syntax. There exists a page in English about the pdoTools parser in the official documentation. But compared to the Russian version, it's currently missing a lot of important information. So I guess we have to learn Russian.
Let's see. Hosfield's new practical method for learning the Russian language. 11th lesson.
11-й урок.
To whom do these miserable houses belong?
Кому принадлежать эти домишки?
I neither know the owner of this big clumsy house, nor the owners of these miserable little houses.
Я не знаю ни хозяина этого домища, ни хозяиш этих домишек.
Probably the most important information for people new to Fenom is the following table under syntax. It lists the various MODX tags and their equivalents in Fenom. Fenom has two different ways to write the tags. One uses the variable $_MODX, the other uses modifiers. The latter is probably easier to remember and use. One important difference to MODX tags is mentioned here in the warning box. Fenom differentiates between two types of placeholders. The variables that are passed to a chunk when it is parsed must be accessed with this syntax. These are, for example, the resource fields when using PDO resources. Values that are stored in the placeholders array in the class MODX, however, have to be retrieved with this syntax. Let's look at an example. We have this PDO resources call with normal MODX tags. We rewrite the snippet call to Fenom syntax. If we use the syntax version with the output modifier, we have to add a colon to separate the properties. The properties are in an associative array, like you would write it in PHP. For the other syntax version with the function call run snippet, you add the properties after a comma as a second function argument. For the placeholders in the inline template, we use the syntax with just the variable name. Let's view the resource to see if it works correctly. We add the property setTotal to the snippet call with the value 1. Is this property set, then PDO resources returns the total number of results in a placeholder. Now to access this placeholder that's set in a snippet as a return value, we have to use the other syntax with the placeholder modifier. We have a template variable called myTV. We include this template variable in the snippet call. Now when we want to output the TV value in the template chunk, the usual syntax doesn't work. The problem is that the placeholder name contains a dot, and variable names with dots are not valid in PHP. So we have to change the tag to use the variable $_PLS instead. This variable is an array that contains all the properties. Now when we view the page, the output is correct. In the documentation, this is described here in this section, placeholders with dots or hyphens. What's missing in the table with the different MODX tags is the fast field tag. In Fenom, these tags can be written like this, where you start with the ID, use the modifier resource, and then provide the field as the option. The superglobals can be accessed directly like this. Let's test it in the manager. We output the page title of the resource with ID equals 2. And a get parameter with the key foo. So at this point you might be thinking, that's all well and good, but what am I really gaining here? My site might get a bit faster by rewriting the tags to Fenom, but now I have to learn a completely new syntax. One of the strengths of Fenom comes into play when you want to output different content in your template based on complex conditions, and you don't want to separate this all out into multiple chunks and snippets. With MODX tags, you can implement a basic if-then-else condition with output modifiers. But what if you want to condition the output based on multiple variables? More complex implementations are indeed possible, like shown here in the documentation, but it gets convoluted very fast and quite hard to read. Fenom, on the other hand, provides a set of options for this use case, as shown here in the Fenom documentation. There's an if statement with else if and else clauses like in PHP, which is much easier to read and understand, especially for programmers. There is also a switch statement, if you want to handle a lot of different cases. And even a foreach construct to iterate over an array. Let's implement an example. When we add the property return to the pdoResources call, with the value data, the snippet returns the result as an array. We assign the result to a variable. Now we can use foreach to loop over the resources. Foreach else is executed if the array is empty. This is the result. Let's add an if condition to the loop. For the resources with the IDs 3 or 4, we display the output in red. And children of this resource get colored in blue. Let's now do something similar with a switch statement. This time in the chunk myTPL. Again, we add different colors to the items, based on the ID. This is the output. Fenom has modifiers. These are similar to MODX output modifiers. The available options are listed here in the documentation. As we have seen before, you write a pipe character, then the name of the modifier, and the parameters after a colon, if there are any. Let's use the date modifier in the manager to output the published on date. Like with MODX output modifiers, you can create a custom modifier in a snippet. This is described here with an example. Alternatively, you can add the custom modifier in a plugin that runs on the event pdoTools on Fenom init. An example is given here. You use the function add modifier of the Fenom variable to supply the custom function. The first parameter is the modifier name. The implementation with the plugin is faster than using a custom snippet. In the code, the modifiers are defined in the class Fenom of the namespace modxpro /pdoTools /parsing /Fenom. They get added in the function _add default modifiers. You can see here what modifiers are available and how they are implemented. Be aware that this list is different from the MODX output modifiers that are defined in the class modOutput filter. In the syntax section of the documentation, we have seen this variable $_MODX that can be used to access resource fields, display chunks, run snippets, etc. This variable is an object of the class app in the namespace MODXpro, pdoTools, parsing, Fenom, support. The class implements a collection of functions that let you access pdoTools or MODX functionality. For example, this function makeURL calls the function with the same name in MODX. It's used for a link tag. $_MODX provides more functionality than listed in this table that you can directly use in the template. For example, you get access to the cache manager. Or you can check user permissions. It's also possible to redirect to another resource or to set a placeholder. And much more. Fenom also has some drawbacks. Because curly braces are used for the Fenom tags, other occurrences of curly braces in the content can break the site. And curly brackets are quite often used in JavaScript or for JSON. Let's take a look at this code as an example. Because the JavaScript function has curly braces, the output is empty and there is an error message in the log. One way to fix it is to add a space character after the opening curly bracket. Because Fenom tags can't have a space after the opening bracket, the JavaScript code won't be misinterpreted as a Fenom tag anymore. Another way is to surround the critical section with an ignore tag. The text inside the tag won't be processed by Fenom. Although you can mix Fenom and MODX syntax, you have to be mindful. Because the order of execution is different in the template than it is in a chunk processed by the pdoTools getChunk function, it's not always clear what gets parsed first. If you run this code in the template, then both MODX snippet tags will be executed before Fenom processes the if statement. But if you put the same code in a chunk and call the chunk with a Fenom tag, then the conditional is processed first and only one snippet is called. What doesn't seem to work at all is if you set a placeholder with a MODX tag and want to use it with a Fenom tag. The snippet setAPlaceholder just sets a placeholder with the values supplied by the properties. When we set a placeholder with a cacheable MODX tag and read the value with Fenom, this only works on the first request. On subsequent requests, the placeholder is never set. If we change the MODX tag to uncacheable, then it never works, because Fenom gets executed first. Fenom tags in the template are like uncacheable MODX tags and will be processed on every page request. An exception are snippet calls that can be called cached by removing the exclamation point. But you have to be careful. If the snippet sets a placeholder, you can't call this snippet cached. This will only work on the first request after the cache was cleared. On subsequent requests, the result of the snippet is read from the element cache. But as placeholders aren't cached, the value won't be available. With MODX tags, you can have a cacheable snippet call and still put uncacheable tags in the output. As an example, we call pdoResources cached. Once with a MODX tag, once with Fenom. Then we put uncacheable snippet calls in the template, myTPL. The snippet getRandomNumber just returns a random number. When we view the page, we can see that only the MODX tag updates the value on subsequent requests. To make this work in Fenom, we have to call the snippet pdoResources itself uncached.
Зачастую, во время первого использования Fenom на рабочем сайте возникает такая ошибка.
Dieser Fehler tritt häufig auf, wenn ein Haartrockner zum ersten Mal auf einer Baustelle verwendet wird.